Hello and welcome to yet another review of a classic science fiction, my go-to, at least this year, probably for some years to come. So, today I am slightly cheated by my lights. The image in the thumbnail is not the book I actually own. That is the book I used to own when I was a teenager, when I first read this book, and which I really wish I'd kept a hold of. It's a Bantam book publication, and I don't know if it was the first or not, or if it was an earlier one, but I think it is an earlier one than the one I have now. And I've always felt that that image on the cover with the Leo, which is a man-lion combination, and the girl standing behind him and him holding a shotgun, I've always thought that that was a tribute, caricature, I don't know, commentary maybe, on the very famous painting American Gothic, in which a white oldish man stares straight into the viewer without smiling, very direct, and he's holding a pitchfork and a woman's just behind his right shoulder. I don't know that I'm 100% sure about, it always reflected that way to me. And American Gothic is one of those American paintings that's been used so often. It's been used in advertisements. It's been used... Advertisements. It's been used in spoofs. It's been used in caricatures. It's a very used picture. And I think it was used for The Bantam Beast by John Crowley. Now, the one I have, however... the artwork, which is still quite beautiful, sort of screams 80s. And the interesting thing is, I didn't go out looking for this book. I found it in a warehouse while I was looking at other books. And while I'd forgotten Beasts as a story, or at least I thought I had, the second I saw this cover image, very different from the cover image on the thumbnail, I think you'll agree, I instantly figured out which book it was, and over the years I've thought of it a few times and wished I still had it to reread it, so I bought this. Now if you look at it, it's got that very 80s look. The jacket that the girl's wearing, the whole girl's hair, which indeed doesn't really correspond in any way to the girl it's meant to be in the book. Those jeans, the t-shirt, the whole thing screams 80s. And there's Peregrine Falcon in the background, which I appreciate because it actually is relevant to the story. I bought this book in what I thought was spectacular condition. There were no creases on the cover. Oh yeah, it's still reversed. Android's still being a pain. Sorry about that. There was no thickening of the pages like you get when it's been read. The cover was in spectacular condition. It's not anymore by any standards or means because I've been reading it, including on the beach. And I was very unhappy when, between page 10 and page 11, this happened. It separated so completely, it was almost as if someone had cut it with a knife. And it's still in pretty good condition. The pages are still attached, but the cover no longer is. And when I had a closer look at it, you can see it's got that darkening around the edges, as if it's been heated too much, as if it's been roasted, and the back cover has it as well. So even though it's still in some ways in pretty good condition for a second-hand book, I think it was actually a new book that got stored in a warehouse. I did find it in a warehouse sale. It was one of those metal storage sheds which in Queensland in summer can basically turn into an oven. I think this got baked in the oven of Queensland. Very sad, because it was in great condition. Anyway, having read that book when I was definitely in my teens, so quite a long time ago, I remembered it, but I remembered only certain parts of it. Rereading it, I had these moments where I never quite knew what was coming, but while I was reading it, I knew what was happening, if that makes sense. That's kind of the way it felt to me. So Beasts by John Crowley. It is very well written, and it's an interesting story, and I think that any classic science fiction reader should enjoy it. It was published in the mid-70s, I believe. Like I said, this copy of mine is from the 80s, so it got republished at least a couple of times. John Crowley's writing is nice, and I wouldn't mind reading more of his work, to be honest, after this one. It's not a perfect book. This isn't a 5 out of 5 star read for me, but I did very much enjoy it. It had a lot of interesting quirks. But anyway, so the part that we start on in this book, I think this is going to be mostly spoiler free. It's from 1970, whatever, who cares? We start in this book with this guy who's just come to the wild, to this old shot tower in the middle of nowhere in the woods. And he's come there with a clutch of falcons, peregrine falcons, that he's reintroducing into the wild. He's part of some environmental group which reintroduces animals into the wild to save them from extinction. Our main character is called Lauren. The shot tower is fascinating. The scene setting in the wilds all throughout, John Crowley does a great job of that. It's well written, it's enjoyable. Now Lauren settles into this very solitary existence while he raises the chicks to fly and learn to hunt. And he goes as he expected to. He's been in the wilds before. He expects to go a little bit cray-cray from solitude, and he does. So Lauren, debating himself through loneliness and arguing with characters that he finds in magazines that have been left in the hut. That's how one learns about this future world and its politics. It's a pretty good method. It doesn't feel too info-dumpy. And he breaks off his arguments with politicians from the magazines for long enough to show us more of the world. So there seem to be two main power blocks in terms of politics. There's federals. This is America, by the way. Future America. Certainly not dystopian, but certainly not the way it is today. There have been a lot of extinctions, a lot of habitat wrecking. Humans aren't quite the same, and cities certainly aren't the same. So you've got federals. I gather they're very different from what feds or federals would mean in America today. It sounds like a sort of small, almost outpost organization and political party. And there's another one that's called the USAE, which is the Union for Social Engineering. It is described by Lauren as a Jesuit-style organization, which would probably mean more to me if I knew about Jesuits. I don't know very much about them, except that they're a Christian organization that concentrates on learning quite a bit, which sounds good to me, and teaches its members to debate and argue, which sounds okay. So I don't know. From this description, I end up knowing not very much about the USC. You have to learn it as you go along. The two political teams, I've got to say, never really engaged me. The concept was good. And while this doesn't feel like a political novel, politics underscore virtually the whole plot in strange and not always entirely obvious ways. So, yeah, anyway. So Lauren, talking to himself, also introduces us to the DNA experiments which have happened in this future world. Apparently, they were really big on trying to recombine human DNA with the DNA of other animals. I think that's more of a 60s and a 70s concept, and I think there's a lot of other sci-fi that did it. John Crowley does it too. Most of them failed. There was no ability to match DNA between species, but there was one big success. Somehow crossing line and human DNA not only was successful, but it created a whole separate species or subspecies which is able to breed and has been renewing itself. It's deeply controversial. They aren't considered humans. They are kind of outcast, and one of the two political organizations, and I'm not entirely sure which one, kind of wants to eradicate them in sneaky ways. I think there's a lot of commentary here on how colonists in America and probably other countries treated the First Nations or the indigenous species of the countries they were conquering. And a couple of references actually made to First Nations Americans. They do, I think, call them Indians, but it's an old book. Don't blame it. Don't really remember the context, but I don't feel that John Crowley ever really bludgeons you over the head with his concepts. I think he enjoys his stories and his concepts are wound through it. You can very much enjoy the story ignoring the politics largely, and if he's got causes that he's championing in there, such as the environmental causes, which are very real, you can still enjoy the story without feeling being bludgeoned, which is a good thing. Some people over bludgeon you. Okay, Lauren himself is an interesting character, and the way he's presented makes him feel like he's going to be our main character, but we don't really have a main character. We have a lot of different threads, and each one of them is very separate to the others, and they come together in a way that feels a bit forced, to be honest. But on page 16, there was a good bit. Yes. Not desiring power himself, Lauren couldn't conceive of someone acting solely to gain it, by lying, compromise, indirection, by not seeing reason. If a man could be shown the right of a case, and surely Lauren was right in this case, and then he didn't do it, he appeared to Lauren to be a fool, or mad, or criminal. Lauren is who I was when I was a teenager. I genuinely thought that by showing people sense you could make them be sensible. I was so wrong. So wrong. Anyway, so Lauren was there basically to tell us about the world and the Leos. And the end of this particular section is when Lauren finds out... oh, I'm sorry. I'm not going to start again. I'm too far in. Lauren... funding is pulled. He has to leave his project and he's going off to be tutor to some children of a very important person. At first he says no, but when he hears who the person is, he agrees. And then we move away from Lauren. We then split to Painter and Caddy. Now this is the story that I originally remembered. I didn't remember it entirely accurately, but that was the one that I remembered. Caddy is a young girl who is indentured to what basically sounds like a pub or a hotel owner. Her parents were intellectuals, they became refugees and they left and went north, and Caddy became orphaned and now she's basically indentured servant. She does a bit of everything in this pub. Painter is a Leo, one of these human lion DNA crossed. He's male. The description that Crowley gives to the Leos is quite magnificent. And I'm going to say, if like me, you really enjoy having stories about animals or about zoology or about ethnology or about psychology of animals and humans and all of that sort of good science fiction-y stuff, this should be right on your wish list, along with, I don't know, the Telsey Tales, Andre Norton, Eye of Cat, all of those ones. This is right up there in different ways, but definitely. So you've got this Leo called Painter, and he buys Caddy, the indenture to Caddy, off the person who is her, whatever you call the guy who indentures you. And they and a couple of ponies head out into the wilds. And I remember this story because it is very vivid. Caddy's a teenager. At first she's really, really angry at having been sold in this way without being consulted. And she's scared and uncertain about the Leo, which is the way most people feel about them. And there's this adjustment of her to travelling with him. They're not travelling. She's an experienced traveller herself. She's actually the better trails person, which is why he bought the indenture to her. And there's a lot there. What exactly Painter is looking for out in the wilds slowly becomes clear. And again, there's a political element to that. But this is very much an adult novel. And at some point, Caddy starts becoming attracted to Painter as a male. And yeah, there's some cross-species sex that might not be everyone's cup of tea. So if you don't like... if you don't like sexy times, this book might not be for you. It's not overt, but in a couple of places it certainly takes an interesting twist on it. And one of the reviews on the back, here we go. A review from Penthouse saying that it's unforgettable. And Penthouse was right. I didn't forget it after all those years. So Caddy and Painter are heading out, and eventually they find that she finds that he's searching for a man for a person that other people are searching for. And when they find them, we find out that the Leo human cross isn't the only one that succeeded. It's the only one that's created a separate race with viable children, but they also successfully managed to cross human with fox once, and that produces Reynard. So Reynard is very much a political mover. He's behind politicians, he's involved in all this stuff, and indeed we eventually find out that he's the force behind the politician whose children Lauren has gone to tutor. So it all ties in. But the story of Painter and Caddy finds out that she can't actually be indentured to a Leo, it's against the law, and she doesn't care at this point, she just keeps following him. Leos live in prides, and Painter has a pride. They're somewhere else, and when he goes to reunite with them, Caddy goes with him. And Reynard is the one who suggests that because they basically have to escape from humans who want to hunt them down and do horrible things to them, much like colonizers did to Indigenous and First Nations everywhere, Reynard actually suggests that they go to the Genesis Reservation. Skip to the next part where we come to the mountain. I love the mountain. The mountain and the Genesis Reservation are a great world building story. So apparently there was this man called Candy, and I can't find that this is based on any real person, but it might well be. He envisaged a self-sufficient community which doesn't take anything from its environment that it doesn't put back. So you've got this huge thing. It's described as immense. It's towers upon towers upon towers, so much so that by the time sunset is happening on the lower levels, the top levels still have minutes worth of full sun. It's a fascinating sort of hive, closed community that's self-sufficient, and people living there are all vegetarians, and they all have a commitment to environment and to keeping the Genesis Reservation intact. So you've got this huge tower where all the people live, but because of that, all the way around it, it's basically a reservation where plants and animals can return to their natural state without being interfered with by humans. Great concept. And of course, this was a concept that was very, very in vogue in the 60s and 70s sci-fi. There's a few good, really good stories. I think Silverberg had a couple. It's a great concept. My favourites, of course, are always going to be the aquatic and marine ones. I love the ideas of closed, self-sufficient communities under the ocean. There were a few of those, not as many. Oh, also, the closed community has become topical once again because you may or may not be aware of Saudi Arabia's NEOM project, combining neo, which is new in Latin, with which I think it means building in Arabic or Aramaic. They also envisaging this closed community stretching in a line. Anyway, I was a little bit disappointed in a few ways by the mountain because it ends up being a Christian enclave, and I've been reading American sci-fi can't seem to get away from religion, and I get bored with having it inserted into everything. It didn't need to be there, and it seemed to be pointless, but it was there. Whatever. The mountain doesn't really feature after it's explained the concept of the living situation and introduces one player called Merrick. Merrick goes out to take photos and record the pride with which Caddy is now living on the reservation, and like Caddy, he becomes so fascinated and intoxicated with the pride and the Leos, he basically goes back to the mountain, splits up with his girlfriend, takes away all his recording gear, and follows them out. And then we don't really see Merrick again, but his actions are part of the plot. So that's interesting as well. Then we skip to a whole different narrative. The end of the mountain bit is the feds. I think it's the feds, and it might be the USC, and I think they might be working together, or maybe they're not. They basically kind of trick the mountain into giving them the right to go and hunt the Leos on their reservation by saying that they're criminals or something like that. So they actually capture Painter. But the rest of the Pride, a couple of them are killed, most of them escape. Now we step into this separate narrative, which is about a dog pack being led by Sweetie. This is a pack that's living in, I'm pretty sure, New York, with that big park, Grand Central Park. Is that a thing? I think that's a thing. And these are basically dogs that have escaped from their owners. And Sweetie is a dog that was German Shepherd crossed with Mutt. And when his owners fled or were taken into a refugee camp, he was taken in to be experimented on. The way in which he was experimented on had something to do with EEGs. He doesn't go into it too greatly, but it changed his mind, so he's got a human element. He's got the capacity to think about things, plan. He's still very much a dog, but there's this added dimension that makes him not very dog-like in some way. So eventually Sweetie escapes, and that's a pretty cool story. And he's living with this dog pack in Central Park, that's the one. And eventually he meets up with Painter, who's escaped from his imprisonment, and that's a great story, which you should read. You should read this book in case I hope you're getting that message. Apparently, from the fact that the two of them have been experimented with in some way by humans, they can communicate mentally sometimes in a strange way. It's really weird. And I really liked it. So this park episode was a chance for Crowley to introduce to us how devastated and destroyed the cities are, how dysfunctional, what's happening in them. Great scene building. Each one of these characters, each one of these story plots is basically a way for him to show us a part of this world, which is really well thought out and really fascinating. And his writing, as you probably figured out from that little passage, is very nice indeed. So all of that is enjoyable in its own right. Painter and Sweetie escape from New York, pun intended. And this section did convince me that Crowley knew nothing about rats, but that he was really interested in exploring the human-animal mental interfaces and how by DNA or other experimentation you could bring a human and animal into an alignment that isn't quite either, but still combining characteristics of both. So the Leos definitely have human characteristics. They're more human than lion in many ways. But in some ways, they've kept attitudes from a lion that combine with human behaviors in a strange way. He makes them quite alien, quite strange, and quite interesting. So Crowley may not know much about rats, but we then skip to Lauren, who's left his tutorship of the two kids. The two kids have headed off to try and save the Leos in the national park. He's now working with geese. And at this point he goes into a coy description about how in the last century, according to the book timeline, there was this great ethnologist, which is misspelt by the way in the book, who talked about geese. And Lauren is basically grey-lag geese in Europe, and Lauren's basically trying the same thing on a different genus of geese in America. I am 99% certain that he's talking about the wonderful Conrad Lorenz, who wrote King Solomon's Ring. This is one of the most amazing books. It's non-fiction, it's ethnology. He was one of the two fathers of ethnology. And yes, there's dogs and there's greylags, and I think there's no doubt at all that Crowley did read that book and possibly more of Lorenz's work, and that very much influenced Beasts, which I loved. So there's some great concepts and there's some great questions. The political narrative is pretty major and it's underlying throughout. The speculation into beast-human interface is really awesome. The world building in its different spots is spectacular. However, these disparate threads to me seem to be gummed together in a very forced way. Very forced. You've got the two kids, you've got Lauren, you've got Raynard, the human fox, you've got the Leos, and they all mishmash together in a way that, like I said, all I can say is it felt forced. And at that point, it felt like Crowley had written this great book. He's just trying to figure out how to finish it off. And some of the things he did felt disjointed, and I didn't love them. There's also a lot of self-contradictory there. So we've got Reynard the Fox, who, or a clone of the fox at least, gives this long speech about how he doesn't make plans. He's not a planner, and that's a complete eye roll. Throughout this book, we've been shown how Reynard is basically the force behind the political players, how he has played the players to aim the political parties in the direction he wants them to go. So, I do not plan. I mean, is this a book of 5 ring things? I make no plan, I make grabbing the bull by the forelock my plan. I don't buy it. This guy is a planner, and we've got these constant references to Aesop fables where the wise fox, the canny fox, etc., etc. And after he's given us this little lecture about how he doesn't make any plans, the last scene of the book is how all the different parts of this story sit down together to start to make plans. It's like, ay, stop that. There's other elements that don't come together perfectly for me, but while not a 5 out of 5 star read, it's a very, very good read, and it's very memorable. I remembered many parts of it. I definitely remembered my enjoyment of it. I thoroughly recommend it to anyone who has found any part of this review intriguing. The one thing I haven't really mentioned is that the writing is very nice. With 60s and 70s sci-fi writers, that can be hit or miss. Some of the writing is very well crafted, some of it's very workmanlike, some of it's very literary, like The Handmaid's Tale, which I just finished. This falls in between. The writing is very nice indeed. It's certainly no workman-like writing. It's very descriptive, it's very beautiful. Its characterization is really, really good, which I appreciate after having had 1 or 2 with no characterization. The individual characters stayed in my mind over the years without me having reread that. It's kind of no higher praise with my memory and my book consumption. So yes, that's Beasts by John Crowley. Thoroughly recommend it to anyone who likes combinations of sci-fi and animals. The dystopian is subtle. The sex between Caddy and Painter is disturbing. The concepts of how political parties might reform and how people might strive to save the natural environment when we've already caused massive extinctions. We hear about the blue whales are gone. I think all the whales are gone. The peregrines on the verge of extinction, and many others. So there's a lot there. I'm doubtless going to remember in 10 minutes other things that I could have told you about that would have been interesting, but hopefully that's enough to intrigue anyone who's watched this review, and enough for me to remember this book, even if I don't hang on to that one. I really want to hang on to that one if I've got space. But yes, this is a book that will stay with you, and it's got a lot of good stuff to it. So thank you for watching. Comment, all that sort of thing if you feel like it. If you can think of any books that you really loved that had a close community based in an aquatic or marine environment, recommend them to me always. And have a great day.